Well, let me ask you this about the book. And if you could tease us with a few examples off the top of your head that you could think of. Early in the book, the Bible, I'm speaking of, can you hint at some key elements among these books that tell us or hint at us? So, what are some of the motifs that say, hey, this happened after the destruction of Babylon or post Persia or something? Is there a certain theme that we
Well,
see?
we talked about the Exodus, right? So that's a big one. And as I said, there's a longstanding move between Egypt and other places. But what we have in the Exodus story of the book of Exodus of the Bible is very much an attempt to say, we did it without the king. We no longer have a king. And therefore it's all, our God, and we can be still saved, Now, what about Genesis that comes before Exodus? Well, Genesis is very hard for people to understand. Well, how is that a response to defeat? It's just about, Abram and Sarah and everybody just making a family and growing and all the family disputes. What the book of Genesis is about is that we have to remember that Abram and Isaac and Jacob and all the children and all of the women themselves represent different communities, different regions, different territories. These are not just stories about people. They are myths about ancestors, and the communities are often named after the ancestors. So all of the 12 sons of Jacob, those are names of tribes in a regions. They have nothing to do with individual figures until the biblical authors make them into some kind of ancestors that were connected, and the names that they have are the ones that they give to their posterity. But that's all an attempt to say all of these communities, we go back to one family. Now that we're defeated and conquered, we got to come together. We were a family, a nation, emerging way back in the midst of the ancient world, whatever. You get the point. Way back in the early history, we came together and a family emerged, and we can do that now today. And that is very much an attempt to say that before we had a kingdom, right? Once again, the kingdom's not there. What brought us together was our worship of one God, of this Yahweh. And that is their attempt, their theological attempt to connect the dots, meaning connect all of these different regions and say, let's come together around this. But they do it also in a family story that is, remember, Abraham is chosen by Yahweh, Abraham and Sarah. And so the narrative is very much about a deity and a people who emerge into a family. And that story then lays the groundwork for families in the post-exilic period, meaning after the destruction, to kind of return to that model of we can still be a larger family, if you will. Our communities can come together because we did it long ago. And I'm not making that all up. It sounds like, well, what evidence do you have for that? We can find all of these names and different things in the older sources as well as extra biblical sources, and they have nothing to do with the book of Genesis.
Right.
And the book of Genesis is what creates a narrative out of them.
So you have family bonds or mythic narratives constructing how these other tribes and various groups actually connect in our family, which is interesting. It's a genealogy. You also see a lot of those genealogy kind of moves with the Greeks, the way that they have genealogies as well. But I think of the Sumerian kings list, but it's not quite the same. That's really, those are all kings. And so what I find interesting about what you're saying is you got, let's create a past for these tribes. You also are saying this is post monarch. So now you're meaning, or better yet, this is post us having kings, which is why the narrative.
So you mentioned this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Sumerian king list. I talk about that, and it's so there's this narrative from one king to the next king to the next king, and we have them in the Bible from one king to the next king. And the Sumerian king list is very, very old, right? Older than the Bible. But you couldn't make a case that the Bible is old on that basis, because the way the Sumerian king list works, it's all about the kings, and the biblical sources are saying, yes, there's some kings and there's dynasties and so forth, but that they're not at the beginning of our history, right? They create a mythic prehistory.
Right.
And that goes for most of the Bible, from Genesis all the way to the narrative of, just to remind you, is from Genesis to the book of Kings. The book of Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. We don't have that in Christian Bibles, but in the Jewish Bible, and you can see it a little bit in the Christian Bibles, that's the original narrative. It ends with defeat. And that narrative only has one book, really, maybe two books, the book of Samuel and Kings, that talk about this. All the other stuff that people read today, no one reads the book of Kings, right? No one teaches the book of Kings, maybe a few stories about Elijah and Elisha, but it's not really stuff that people get most of their theology from. They get their theology from Pentateuch, from Genesis, from all of that stuff. And all of that stuff is very easy to see as a way to preface this history with all of these things that are going to be essential strategies for survival for communities who no longer have that kingdom. Once again, go ahead.
I was going to say the Judges condemns the idea of kings. Like, they're already pointing toward the idea of kings are coming, and you're going to see why that isn't good. But at the same time, you're also seeing promises of like later, so they can't let go of the memory or the idea of us. One day the Messiah will come, and one day, we'll have this kingship that'll be ruled by God, where God will actually come in. So they kind of don't want to let go of that, but they also have to explain why we don't have that.
Yeah. And one of the more important points about this is that you have people who are looking at the book of Genesis and they find these parallels, and they're trying to make a story about how things come together, let's say in ancient, oral tradition, and this goes way back and so forth. And I'm trying to show it's not oral tradition that makes these stories. It's not something that goes way back. It's the attempt by scribes. So to answer the question of like, who wrote the Bible? It's attempt by nameless scribes over generations to connect various communities together in a literary way through text, not through oral traditions, not through things that people knew all the time. There is one kind of new approach, the documentary hypothesis, right? It goes back to Wellhouse, and he was the one who really popularized it. It's the JEPD. I don't know if your viewers will know a lot about that, but it's not useful anymore to know, because that theory really doesn't hold water very much. That theory says all these sources go back to the kingdom period or earlier. Right. Even the latest source, the priestly source, is like preexilic. If that's the case, and most Americans kind of follow that, if that's the case, then my whole thesis is wrong. I'm saying everything is a response to defeat. And there's a neo-documentary hypothesis, and it's defended by some scholars at big schools throughout the US. And it tries to argue that actually these sources, they knew nothing of each other. So there's the one source that tells about the Exodus and another story that tells about the Exodus, but they don't know each other. These sources, whatever, how you imagine that. And the problem with that is they can make a claim that because these sources are telling about the Exodus independently of each other, that there must have been a common tradition about the Exodus.
Right.
So our approach that I learned from Germany, in my work in Germany, I spent most of my studies there, is no, there is a text. It's like a snowball, and it grows in each generation. So there's this kind of early idea about this Exodus, and it just emerges. Or the early idea about maybe some ancestors, but you can't get back to it very much, but you can see how it grows in each generation. It's not a bunch of independent sources that were compiled like these neo-documentarians say. They were compiled by one editor. These are older historical sources. Right. They may not tell the history, but what they do show us is that everybody kind of agreed on the basic outline of Israel's history. And I try to show the basic outline of Israel's history is a construction by very intelligent scribes, but they're doing it with an eye to their communities, bringing them together, unifying them, trying to give them something that will hold them together when they no longer have a palace to do so.